The land lies flat under a wide sky in the north of the peninsula, a low shelf of pale limestone barely raised above the sea, and across the whole of it there runs no river, no stream, no open water that holds its course through the year. The rock beneath the thin red soil is porous and broken, a karst of cracked and dissolving stone, so that the rain which falls in the wet months does not gather and flow across the surface, but sinks at once through the ground and travels unseen below it, collecting far down in a hidden sheet of water that the land above gives no sign of. Only where the roof of the limestone has fallen in, where the slow working of water has eaten a hollow and the ground has settled into it, does that buried water show itself. In the steep round wells the Maya named Zonot and the Spanish later called cenotes, and it was upon two such wells that the city was set. To the north, a little apart from the dwellings, lay the great one, the sacred cenote, a sheer shaft in the rock some 60 meters across, with the green water standing more than 20 meters below its broken rim, walled on every side by vertical stone, hung with vine and root. Nearer the center lay the other, the cenote called Stolok, lower and more open and easier of approach, from which the people of the city drew the water they drank and carried and cooked with. And it was the certainty of that water in a country with no rivers that fixed the place and held the city to it across the generations. Around the wells the land ran level in every direction, a flat floor of forest and field, reaching to a soft and distant horizon, the limestone showing gray through the soil wherever the cover was thin, the whole shelf tilting so gently toward the northern coast that the eye could not read the slope, and the country seemed to lie wholly even from edge to edge. The forest that covered the unworked ground was a dry tropical woodland, low and close and tangled, its trees shedding their leaves through the long rainless season and standing bare and gray under a hard sun, then leafing thick and green again when the rains returned, so that the country changed its color twice in the year between a brown and silver dryness and a heavy summer green. Among those trees stood the ramon, the bread nut, whose seed could be ground and eaten, and which grew thick about the old dwellings, and the sapodilla, whose hard wood was cut for the lintels of the temples, and whose trunk yielded a milky gum, and the ceiba, and the gumbo limbo, and the thorny scrub of the driest ground, the whole woodland low enough that the raised platforms of the city stood clear above it. Through this forest, the people of the city had cut their fields, the milpa plots where the maize was grown, clearings opened in the trees, and worked for a few seasons and then left to the forest again, so that the land around the stone core was a shifting mosaic of standing woodland and burned clearing and young regrowth, threaded by the paths that led from the dwellings to the plots and the wells. The climate was hot through the whole year and knew no winter cold, only the turning between the dry and the wet, and the heat lay heavy on the flat land through the middle of the day, and eased a little in the long evenings when the light went gold across the plaster and the stone. And now and again, in the late wet season, a great storm came up from the warm sea to the east and crossed the peninsula in wind and rain before it passed. There were no hills to break the plain near the city, no high ground from which to look down upon the dwellings, for the low limestone ranges of the Pook lay far to the south, and the only heights in the whole of the near country were the ones the people raised themselves, the temple platforms and the stepped pyramid standing up out of the flat forest like the single feature in a level land. The rain that fed the wells came in its season from the southeast, building through the afternoons of the wet months into tall gray towers of cloud that broke over the land in warm and heavy downpours, and then withholding itself for half the year together, while the cenotes sank toward their lowest, and the forest dried around them, and the dust rose on the worn paths. The people read this country closely, for it gave little margin, And they set their fields and their wells and their gathered city by the few sure sources of water in a porous land that let the rain fall straight through it and held nothing on its surface. The settlement itself spread far beyond the cleared stone core that the eye now takes for the whole of it, the dwellings and their yards and gardens scattered out across several kilometers of the surrounding country, gathered most thickly near the wells and thinning away toward the open forest, joined to the center and to one another by the white causeways and the worn paths, so that the city was less a walled town than a broad and ordered spread of households across the plain about its temples. The dry forest that closed around this spread held its own life through the turning of the year, the white-tailed deer and the peccary that came to the clearings, the ocellated turkey with its blue and bronze feathers, the curassow and the parrot and the small green forest birds, and in the deeper cover the jaguar and the puma and the smaller cats, while the cenotes held their fish and the swifts and swallows nested in their cliffs. The night over the flat land was wide and dark and thick with stars, for there was no high ground and no haze to dim them, and the people watched the sky closely from the open plazas and the round tower, reading in the risings and settings of the sun and the moon, and the bright planet the order of their calendar and the times of their planting and their rites. From the summit of the Great Pyramid, when it was new, the view ran out over the canopy in every direction, the white causeways drawing their straight lines across the green toward the wells and the outlying groups, the smoke of the cooking fires and the clearing fires rising here and there from among the trees, and beyond the worked land the unbroken forest closing the horizon on all sides, flat and gray and green under the wide and slowly changing sky. At the center of the gathered city rose the temple, the Maya knew as the Pyramid of Kukulkan, the square-stepped mass that later ages came to call El Castillo, a building of 9 receding terraces faced in dressed limestone, with a broad stairway climbing each of its 4 sides to a small temple set upon the summit. It was not a tall building beside the great pyramids of other lands, rising some 30 meters above the plaza, yet on that level floor of forest it stood as the one high thing, and its squared and ordered mass could be read from far off across the canopy, a built mountain in a country that had no mountains of its own. The form of it was governed throughout by the count of days, for the building was a calendar raised in stone, its measure taken not from the eye alone, but from the turning of the year and the long meshing of the Maya counts of time. Each of the 4 stairways held 91 steps, and the 4 together with the platform of the summit temple came to 365, the number of the days in the solar year, so that to climb any face of the pyramid was to ascend the year itself. The 9 terraces of each side were divided by the stairway into 18 sections, the count of the months in the Maya year of 20 named days, and across the faces the recessed panels of the terraces numbered 52 on each side, the years that make the calendar round, the long cycle at whose close the count of the solar year and the count of the sacred days of 260 return together to their common starting point. The building was set, moreover, by the sun, its corners and its faces turned a little from the cardinal points, so that on the afternoons about the spring and the autumn equinox, the lowering sun threw the shadow of the stepped northwest terraces in a line of bright triangles down the western side of the northern balustrade, and that descending band of light and shadow joined to the great carved serpent head at the foot of the stair to make the body of a feathered serpent that seemed to come down the pyramid as the sun went down, gathering each year a crowd to the northern plaza to watch it form and fade. The whole of it had been coated once in lime plaster and painted, the stones smoothed under a skin of burned lime and washed with color, so that the pyramid as it was first raised stood far brighter and more finished than the bare gray masonry that the centuries have left, and the carved serpents and the bands of the terraces carried red and other colors upon the white. There was a further property in its making, for a sound clapped sharply at the foot of the great northern stair returned from the high steps as a long, chirping note. The stone giving back the sound changed, an effect bound up in the very geometry of the risers and treads of the stair. And beneath the visible building lay another, for when the terraces were opened, it was found that the pyramid enclosed an earlier and smaller temple of the same radial form, built over and sealed within the larger mass when the city enlarged its center, its stairway and its summit chamber preserved entire inside the later stone. Within that buried temple stood a throne carved as a jaguar and painted a bright red, its eyes and the spots of its hide set with discs of polished green stone and its fangs of white shell, and before it a reclining stone figure of the kind called a chak mul, lying on its back with its knees drawn up and its head turned to the side, and a shallow dish held upon its belly. To enter the enclosed older temple by the cramped passage cut through the later fill was to stand inside the city's own past. The first pyramid kept whole within the second, the red jaguar throne in its sealed chamber, where the people who built the outer terraces had left it when they raised their greater work above it. The radial form of the building, with its 4 equal stairways rising on the 4 sides to a single summit temple, set it apart from the older Maya temples of the southern lands, which most often carried a single stair upon one face, and that 4-fold ascent gathered the 4 directions of the world into the one mass and made the pyramid a center to which the 4 causeways ran. The terraces themselves were built in the manner that joined a sloping base to a vertical inset panel above it, course upon course of dressed stone laid over the rubble core, and the whole bound and faced with the lime plaster, the corners squared and the proportions held true through the 9 levels, so that the receding terraces drew the eye upward to the small dark doorway of the summit temple. Within that summit temple, reached by the long climb, lay a chamber whose inner room held carved piers and a low bench, and from its doorways the view ran out over the plazas and the colonnades and the white roads and the green forest beyond, the whole of the gathered city laid out below the one high place. The building was raised, moreover, not in a single campaign, but over the enclosed earlier temple, the city deliberately burying its older work and setting the greater pyramid above it, so that the structure holds 2 temples in one, and records in its own fabric the enlargement of the center across the generations of the city's growth. The pyramid thus held its meanings on every side, the year in its steps, the months in its sections, the calendar round in its panels, the sun in its alignment and its descending serpent of shadow, the changed sound in the geometry of its stair, and the city's own history sealed within its core, all of it gathered into a single squared and stepped mass, standing up out of the flat land at the meeting of the 4 causeways. Around the central platform stood the great works that gave the city its particular character, raised in a manner that joined the older Maya building of the Puc Hills to forms and figures carried from the highlands of central Mexico, so that the stone of Chichén Itzá speaks in 2 architectural tongues at once, and is read by those who study it as the meeting of 2 traditions. Largest of all the open works was the great ball court, the broadest in the whole of Mesoamerica, a level alley running some 168 meters between 2 long parallel walls, each wall high and sheer, and set far up its face with a single ring of carved stone through which the players strove to send the heavy rubber ball. Along the base of the walls ran low carved panels showing the players in their heavy padding ranked in procession, and at either end of the alley stood a small temple, the one at the north holding reliefs of seated lords, and along the eastern side rose the Temple of the Jaguars, its inner walls carrying a long painted scene of a settlement beside the water and of warriors gathered in their ranks. The court was famous, too, for its carrying of sound, for a word spoken low at one end ran clear along the whole length of the alley to the other, the high parallel walls returning the voice down the stone. To the east of the main plaza rose the Temple of the Warriors, a step platform fronted and flanked by hundreds of square and round columns, standing in close ranks across a great open hall, the colonnade that came to be called the Group of 1,000 Columns. Its piers carved with warriors and once carrying a flat roof of wooden beam and lime mortar that has long since fallen and left the columns standing open to the sky. At the head of its stair, before the temple door, lay another of the reclining chakmul figures, and the doorway itself was framed by two great columns carved as feathered serpents, their heads resting on the ground with open mouths and their bodies rising to carry the lintel. A little to the south stood the round tower, the Spanish named the caracol for the winding stair within it, a cylinder of masonry set upon broad rectangular terraces, its upper chamber pierced by narrow shafts whose lines of sight ran out to the points on the horizon where the planet Venus set in its long cycle and where the sun stood at the turning of the year, so that the building served the watching of the sky. Across the whole site ran the raised causeways of white plaster, the sakbiub, straight embanked roads laid level across the broken ground from platform to platform, more than 80 of them traced upon the ground in the mapping of the site, the longest running 300 meters north from the central plaza in an unbroken line to end at the very lip of the sacred cenote. There were besides these the low platform of the skull rack carved on every side with rows of skulls, the platform carved with eagles and jaguars taking human hearts, the high temple called the osario or high priest's grave, with a natural shaft sunk through its core to a cave below, the round and stepped buildings of the platform of Venus, and the steam baths of fitted stone where water was poured upon heated rock. To the south lay the older quarter, where the building followed more closely the Puuk manner of the southern hills, the long low ranges of the group called the Nunnery, and the Casa Colorada, and the chambered mass called the Akab Dzib, their plain lower walls carrying above them an upper facade worked into a stone mosaic, and set thick with the hook-nosed masks of the rain god stacked one upon another at the corners. The painted walls of the Temple of the Warriors and of the upper chamber above the ball court carried scenes drawn from the life and the wars of the city, ranks of warriors in their padded armor and their feathered headdresses, processions of figures bearing offerings, a coastal settlement of thatched houses set among canoes upon the water, the colors laid in the blue and the red and the yellow and the green that the walls have since, for the most part, lost. The low colonnaded range called the Mercado, with its broad sunken court and its ring of columns, stood among the southern buildings near the steam baths, those small vaulted rooms of fitted stone with their low doorways and their hearths where the stones were heated and the water poured to fill the chamber with steam, used in the rites of cleansing and of healing. The platform carved with eagles and jaguars stood low and square in the northern plaza near the skull rack, its stairways flanked by serpent balustrades, and its panels showing the great birds and the cats with the human heart held in beak and claw, and beside it the round platform that carried the worship of the planet Venus, its 4 stairs and its conical form set apart from the rectangular masses around it. The buildings of the older southern quarter kept the round-cornered chambers and the corbelled vaults of the Puuk manor, the false arch of stone laid in courses that leaned inward until they met, roofing the long, narrow rooms, while the northern buildings about the Great Pyramid more often spanned their wider halls with the beam and the flat roof of mortar carried upon the ranks of columns, the two ways of roofing standing in the one city, as the two manners of building did. Taken together, the buildings of the center formed not a single plan laid down at once, but a gathered city of platforms and halls and towers and roads, ordered around the four causeways and the great pyramid, built and rebuilt across the generations of the city's height, and joining in their carved stone the two manners, the lowland Maya and the highland Mexican, whose meeting is the lasting signature of the place. In the gray hour before the light, the household fires were woken in the dwellings of pole and thatch that spread out from the stone core of the city, the low rectangular houses of upright poles and plastered walls under steep roofs of palm, gathered in clusters about their swept yards beneath the trees, each cluster the home of a household joined by kin. The first work of the day fell to the women at the hearth, who lifted from its soaking the maize that had stood overnight in water mixed with the lime burned from the limestone, the grain softened and loosened in its skin by that long steeping. A treatment that drew from the maize a nourishment it would not otherwise have given. Kneeling at the sloping stone of the metate, working the long handstone back and forth across it, they ground the wet maize to a smooth dough, and from that dough patted out the thin, flat cakes that were laid to cook on a clay griddle set over the fire, or wrapped the dough in leaves to steam, or thinned it into a drink, the smell of the cooking maize rising through the clusters of houses as the sky lightened over the flat forest. About the yards the turkeys were kept and the hairless dogs that were raised for the pot, and the cotton stood in its plots to be picked and spun, the women setting the spindle, turning in its little bowl through the parts of the day not given to the grinding and the cooking. The men took up their digging sticks and their water gourds, and went out from the dwellings along the field paths and the white causeways toward the milpa plots cut from the forest, where the maize stood among the beans that climbed its stalks, and the squash that ran along the ground between, and there they worked through the cool of the early hours, clearing and weeding and tending and guarding the crop, before the heat of the middle day drove them to the shade. In the stone heart of the city, the work of building went on from the morning, the limestone hauled on rollers and levers and sledges from the quarries that were themselves the sunken floors left by the cutting, the blocks dressed with tools of harder stone to face the rising terraces, the lime burned in open kilns and slaked and spread as plaster over wall and stair, and the broad white floors of the plazas. The market gathered as the sun climbed, in the open ground beneath and beside the colonnades, and upon a walled platform set aside for it, the traders and the growers laying their goods upon mats and the swept earth, the salt brought up from the coast in baskets, the cotton cloth folded in lengths, the long blades of obsidian, the pots and the gourds and the dried fish and the honey and the maize and the beans and the chili and the beans of cacao that served as much for counting and exchange as for the drinking. People came in from the outlying houses and from the country round about, and the talk of the market and the calling of the trades and the smell of cooking and of copal carried across the plaza, while the priests and the lords went about the upper platforms and the temple stairs in the early light in their cotton and their feathers and their jade, and the water carriers went down to the Xtolok cenote and came back along the paths with the day's water on their shoulders in great jars. About the dwellings the children went at their small tasks and their play, fetching and carrying and learning by the side of the elders the work that would be theirs, the girls at the grinding stone and the spindle, and the boys following the men to the field, and the old who could no longer go to the milpa kept the houses and the gardens and the watching of the small children through the day. The loads of the city moved upon the backs of people, for there were no carts and no draught animals, the burden carried in a basket or a net slung from a band of bark or hide passed across the brow, the tump line taking the weight upon the head and the neck, and along the causeways and the paths went the carriers with their loads of stone and wood and water and grain. In the dooryards grew the kitchen gardens, the chili and the squash and the herbs and the fruit trees, the ramon and the avocado and the soursop, tended close to the house where they could be watered and watched. And among the trees the hives of the stingless bees were kept in hollowed logs sealed at the ends, the honey taken for food and for the making of a fermented drink, and the wax put to its uses. The morning had its trades besides the field and the building, the knapper sitting to his core of imported obsidian, and striking off the long blades one after another, the potter at the clay, the weaver at the loom, the carver at the soft limestone, each craft set to its work as the heat came on. The day in the city began thus not with one signal, but with the slow gathering of many tasks, the fire and the grinding stone, the spindle and the loom, the field path and the quarry, the kiln and the market and the well, the whole settlement, waking by its parts into the heat of another day, under the high sun and the wide flat sky. Almost everything raised at Chichén Itzá came in the end from the limestone underfoot, for the land gave little else to build with, and the city was in this sense made of the very ground it stood upon, taken up and shaped and set back down in ordered courses. The stone was quarried in blocks from shallow pits and from the broken outcrops, the softer beds cut more easily, where the rock came fresh and damp from the ground and hardened afterward in the air, the harder beds kept for the facing and the carving, and the sunken floors that the quarrying left behind were sometimes deepened and walled and put to use as tanks and as the foundations of platforms, so that the taking of the stone and the making of the city were one continuous work. The cores of the great masses were filled with rough rubble and earth held by retaining walls, and over them was set the dressed facing stone, cut and smoothed with tools of harder stone and of chert flaked to an edge, for the people of the city worked without iron and without the wheel and without beasts of burden to haul, and raised all that they raised by the liver and the roller and the ramp and the labor of many hands. Over the finished stone went the lime, burned from the same limestone in open kilns, heaped with cut wood, and fired until the rock broke down to a white powder, then slaked with water, and worked into the smooth, hard plaster that coated wall and stair and floor, sealing the masonry against the rain, and giving the bright finished surface that the bare gray ruins no longer show. Much of that plaster was painted, the red of iron earths most common across the walls, and the carved serpents, and the broad bands of the terraces, and among the colors laid into the painted scenes was the deep and lasting blue the makers won by binding a dye drawn from the indigo plant into a pale clay, a blue that has held its color on the stone through the long centuries since. The lintels of the temple doorways were cut from the hard wood of the sapodilla, set across the openings to carry the masonry above, and worked sometimes with carving, and that dense wood has lasted in some of the buildings where it was kept dry, one of the few perishable materials of the city to remain. The potters of Chichén Itzá made the wares of the tradition the study of the site calls sotuta, the gray slate ware most of all, vessels coated in a fine slip and lightly burnished to a soft sheen, dishes and bowls and tall jars, alongside the plainer cooking pots and the coarse storage vessels, and the great jars for the holding of water. They worked also in the harder things of daily use, the grinding stones of rough volcanic rock that had to be carried from far off, for the limestone gave no good grinding surface, the spindle whorls of fired clay for the spinning of cotton thread, the net sinkers and the burnishing stones, the figurines and the censers in which the copal was burned, and the small whistles and rattles of clay. Into the city came finer things made elsewhere and prized for it. The lustrous plumbate ware whose surface fired to a hard gray-green metallic sheen, made far to the south on the Pacific slope and traded across great distances, and the painted polychrome dishes, and the worked shell from the coasts cut into beads and tinklers and ornaments, and above all the green stone, the jade and its kin, brought from the river gravels of the far south, and worked with string and sand and harder stone into beads and ear flares and small carved figures, and the polished discs that adorned the jaguar throne. The weaving of cloth was a labor of the households, and a thing of value both, the cotton picked from the dooryard plots and the field, cleaned and spun upon the drop spindle into thread, and the thread set up on the backstrap loom that the weaver braced against her own body, the warp running from a post or a tree to the band about her waist, and upon it she worked the plain cloth and the patterned, the white and the dyed, the lengths that clothed the people and served in tribute and exchange and went down into the cenote among the offerings. The feathers of the forest birds and of the traded quetzal were bound and sewn into the headdresses, and the fans and the shields of the lords and the warriors. The long green plumes and the blue and the red worked into a craft whose products have not survived in the ground, but show in the painted walls and the carved panels. The people worked, too, in the materials the body of the land and its creatures gave. The bone and the antler of the deer cut into tools and ornaments and the points of weapons, the hide tanned for cord and covering, the gourd grown and dried and cut into bowls and cups and floats and rattles, the reed and the vine and the split wood woven into the baskets, and the mats that furnished every house and carried every load. The making of the city thus ran from the heaviest labor of the quarry and the kiln to the finest work of the lapidary at his jade and the feather worker at his plumes, a whole order of crafts set side by side in the one settlement. The makers of the city thus drew on a near material and a far one, the limestone and lime and clay and chert and hard wood of the place itself for the body of the city and its daily vessels, and the obsidian and jade and metal and fine ware of distant lands for the things of value and adornment, the whole of it gathered into a settlement that built itself from its own ground and finished itself with the goods of half a continent. Chichén Itzá lay inland upon its flat shelf of limestone, a long day and more from any coast, yet it was bound to the sea and through the sea to far places by the small port that served it on the northern shore, the fortified island of Isla Cerritos, lying just off the coast at the mouth of an estuary, where the sea-going canoes were beached behind a built breakwater of stone. There the goods the canoes carried were taken up and moved inland along the road and the causeway toward the city, so that the inland center had its harbor and its window on the long sea routes that ran around the whole rim of the peninsula. The great canoes of the coast working their way from headland to headland with the salt and the cloth and the cacao and the obsidian of distant lands. By those routes, by canoe along the coast and by foot across the interior, came the materials that the limestone country could not give, and chief among them the obsidian, the volcanic glass, flaked into the long fine blades that did the cutting work of a people without metal tools, brought as a gray stone from the highlands of Guatemala away to the south, and as a clear green stone from the great source at Pachuca far to the northwest near the central valleys of Mexico, stone that has no origin anywhere in the flat peninsula, and so marks at a glance the distance the trade reached. Gold came from the isthmus and the lands beyond it to the south, worked into thin embossed discs and bells and ornaments, for the Maya country held no gold of its own. Copper came as small cast bells and as worked sheet from the west of Mexico where the metal was known. Turquoise came in small tesserae for the setting of mosaic from the deserts of the far north. Jade came from the gravels of the Motagua Valley, in the southern highlands. And fine cotton and cacao and the long green feathers of the quetzal and the painted wares moved along the same paths into the city. Against all that came in, the dry peninsula had few bulk goods to send out in return, and the greatest of them was salt, raked from the long coastal lagoons of the northern shore, where the seawater was led into shallow pans and left to dry under the sun and the wind, gathered in great quantity and carried inland and along the coast to lands that had no salt of their own, one of the few things the flat limestone country produced in surplus and traded far. Honey from the stingless bees kept in hollowed logs, and cotton cloth, and worked flint, and captives taken in war went out along the same routes, and the cacao bean served through all this exchange as a measure of value and a means of payment, as well as a thing drunk by the lords. The city stood at a node where the long sea circuit of the peninsula met the roads of the interior, drawing to itself the obsidian of two distant volcanic sources, the gold of the far south, the turquoise of the far north, the jade of the highlands, and the salt and cotton and honey of its own country. The dredging of the sacred cenote, which drew up gold from the isthmus, and jade from the highlands, and copper from the west, and rubber and resin from the lowland forests, shows in a single deposit the gathering of materials from thousands of kilometers in every direction. The whole reach of the exchange concentrated in the offerings cast into one well. The carrying of this trade fell in good part to a class of merchants who moved the goods along the coast and the roads, the seagoing traders of the peninsula's edge, whose great canoes the first Spanish to round the coast met and described, broad vessels cut from a single trunk and roofed amidships, laden with cloth and obsidian and copper and cacao and worked stone, and the people taken in war, paddled by many hands along the shore from port to port. The island shrines of the eastern coast served these traders as marks and stations upon their long routes, and the cacao that passed through their hands was counted bean by bean as the money of the land, a measure in which a price could be set and a debt reckoned, so that the bean was at once a thing drunk by the lords and the common coin of the markets. The salt of the northern lagoons moved in great quantity along these same routes, gathered in the dry season when the sun drew the water from the pans, and the white crust was raked and dried and carried, a trade so steady and so wide that the lords of the coast who held the salt flats drew wealth and standing from the holding of them. Into the markets of the inland city, then, the long trade brought not only the rare and the precious, but the steady necessities that the dry shelf could not make for itself, the grinding stone and the obsidian blade and the salt, and out of it went the surplus of its salt and cotton and honey, the whole bound into a web of exchange that reached by sea around the peninsula and by land into the highlands and the lands beyond. It was this position upon the trade, as much as the certainty of its water, that raised Chichén Itzá above the other towns of the northern plain, a gathering point for the goods of a continent set down upon a flat shelf of stone, that of itself produced almost nothing but salt and maize and limestone. As the light went long across the plain, the field workers came back along the white causeways and the field paths toward the dwellings, the heat of the middle day, lifting off the plaster of the plazas as the sun dropped toward the level horizon, and the shadows of the platforms reached out across the open ground. The cooking fires were woken again in the swept yards, and the second meal of the day was made ready. The maize once more in another form, ground and cooked as the morning's flat cakes, or boiled whole in its lime-softened state, or simmered into a thick warm drink, set out with the beans and the squash and the chili, and whatever the day had yielded of fowl or fish, or the small game of the forest, the venison of the deer that came to feed in the milpa, and the flesh of the turkeys raised about the houses. In the cool that followed the heat, the people gathered, the households at their hearths, and the lords and their followers under the painted beams of the colonnaded halls, where the long ranks of columns held the open rooms, and the trade and labor of the day gave way to the quieter business of the evening. The settling of matters, and the telling of accounts, and the eating together in the failing light, the lords drinking the cacao frothed and spiced from painted cups. On certain days the long alley of the ball court drew the watchers before the light was gone, and the heavy ball of solid rubber was driven from hip and forearm and thigh against the sloping walls and along the level floor, the players in their thick padding moving the ball down the court while the crowd stood along the high walls above, the game bound up with the order of the world and the turning of the sky, and not played for sport alone. The sound of the evening carried across the plazas, the low double-headed drums and the upright drums of wood and skin, the flutes and the whistles of clay, the rattles and the long deep note of the conch shell trumpet, the music rising at the feasts of the lords and the observances of the priests. The smoke of copal incense rose from the small shrines and from the dish-bearing stone figures before the temples as the day ended, the sweet resin smoldering in the censers, and the priests went about the closing observances upon the upper platforms, while the watchers of the sky took their places at the round tower. The sky reddened behind the squared mass of the Great Pyramid, the light catching last upon its summit temple, while the plazas below fell into shade, and the swifts that nested in the cliffs of the cenote and the crannies of the stone wheeled out into the dusk after the evening insects. The brief tropical twilight came on quickly, the color draining from the western sky, the fires glowing brighter in the yards as the dark gathered under the trees, and the stone of the city, warmed through the long day, gave back its heat into the cooling air, so that the plazas stayed warm a while after the sun was down. In the dwellings the night was passed upon mats spread on the low plastered benches, or the swept floor, the household drawn in around the banked fire whose embers held against the cool that came with the small hours, the doorways hung with cloth, the dogs lying near, and over the sleeping houses the wide flat country lay dark under its stars. The watchers of the sky kept their stations in the dark, marking the slow wheel of the heavens, the rising of the bright planet before the dawn and its setting after the dusk, the path of the moon among the stars, the band of faint light the people read as a road across the sky. And from these motions the calendar priests drew the order of the days and the seasons of write and planting. The old told over the accounts of the ancestors and the gods, and the founding of the city to the young gathered near the fire, the tellings that carried the memory of the people from one age to the next, and the long warm night drew on, the forest loud with its insects and the calls of the night creatures, until in the cool before the light the fires were woken once more, and the grinding began again. So the day closed as it had opened, by the slow gathering and letting go of its many tasks, the household and the city sinking together into the dark and the quiet. The same hours that the morning had filled with the grinding stone and the field path and the market were filled now with the second meal, and the gathered talk and the music, and the drifting incense and the slow coming of the dark, the day turning at its evening end as it had turned at its dawn, by the same round of tasks seen from the other side, the city settling toward its night under a sky going from red to violet to the deep blue in which the first stars stood out over the flat and darkening forest. At the northern end of the longest quay, 300 meters out from the central plaza, lay the great place of offering, the sacred cenote, its green water standing far below a sheer rim of broken limestone, and into that water across many generations the people of the city cast objects of value and the bodies of the sacrificed. The well was not a source of drinking water, for it lay apart, and its surface was hard to reach below the vertical walls. It was set aside for the giving of offerings, approached along its own white road from the center of the city, and the things let down or thrown into it gathered in the mud of its floor, and were held there in the dark water until the dredging and the diving of much later ages brought them up again. From that mud and from the depths came a great quantity of worked jade, beads and ear flares, and carved plaques and small figures, and discs of hammered gold, worked in low relief, with scenes of seated figures, and of serpents, and of the rites of war, and bells and ornaments of gold and of copper, and balls and shaped figures of copal incense and rubber, and the remains of wood and of cloth and of basketry, and of carved wooden weapons that the water had kept from rotting, and the bones of those who had been given to the well. The human remains drawn from the cenote were of many people across a long span of time, and the study of the bones has shown them to be both grown men and women, and a notable number of children and adolescents, the offering of life joined to the offering of jade and gold and incense in the giving to the water of the well. Over the whole city presided the feathered serpent, Kukulkan, the plumed snake whose name the Great Pyramid carried, and who was kin to the Quetzalcoatl of the highland peoples to the west, rendered as the descending band of shadow on the pyramid's balustrade at the equinox, and carved as the great serpent columns at the doorways, and as the heads that rested at the feet of the stairs, the body of the city's chief divinity worked into its principal stone. Near the ball court stood the long, low platform of the skull rack, the tzompantli, its vertical sides carved in rank upon rank of skulls in profile, the stone image of the racks of poles on which the heads of the sacrificed were set, and beside it the platform carved with eagles and with jaguars, each holding a human heart in its claws, the imagery of the orders of warriors and of the offering of the heart upon the altar. Before the temples lay the reclining chak-mul figures, the stone men on their backs with knees drawn up and head turned aside and the shallow dish held upon the belly, and into those dishes went the burned copal and the offerings of the rite, the smoke rising from the temple platforms into the still air. The rites reached also into the body of the worshippers themselves, in the drawing of blood from the ear and the tongue and the limb with blades of obsidian and the spines of the stingray, the blood caught upon bark paper and burned with the incense, an offering of the self set beside the offering of jade and life. The turning of the calendar carried its own observances, the close of the great cycles marked upon the platforms, the watching of Venus and the sun and the moon from the round tower ordering the days of ceremony, and the ball game itself carried its weight of meaning. The court a place of more than play, its carved panels showing the players and the rites that attended the game, the movement of the ball read against the movement of the heavens and the powers of the world below. The keeping of these rites fell to an order of priests who held the count of the days and the reading of the signs, who knew the long meshing of the sacred count of 260 days with the solar year and the greater cycles beyond them, and who set by that count the times of ceremony and of planting and of the offering at the well. The burning of copal, the pale resin gathered from the forest trees and shaped into balls and figures, ran through all the rites, its sweet white smoke rising from the censers of clay and the dishes of the stone figures, a thing given to the gods at every observance and cast in quantity into the cenote among the other offerings. The dead were given their place in this order, the lords laid in the chambers of the temples and beneath the floors with the jade and the shell and the pottery that went with them. The high priest's grave sunk through its shaft to the cave below, holding the burials of those set within it, so that the ancestors lay within the very platforms upon which the living kept their rites. On the days appointed, The people gathered in procession along the white causeways and through the plazas, the priests in their feathers and their painted bark, the drums and the conch and the burning incense going before, the whole settlement drawn into the public observance of the calendar, the dancing and the offering and the watching of the sky carried out before the gathered city. The rites of the city thus reached from the drawing of a little blood and the burning of incense in the dish of a stone figure, to the casting of gold and jade and life into the deep green water of the well at the causeway's end, the whole bound to the feathered serpent and the rain and the sun and the orders of the sky, carried out upon the platforms and in the court and at the cenote across the long generations of the city's height. The year upon the northern plain turned not upon the cold and the warmth, for the country knew no winter, but upon the water, divided cleanly into a long dry season, reaching from the late autumn through the spring, and a wet season of heavy afternoon rain through the summer and into the early autumn. And on this turning the whole life of the city was set. Through the dry months the forest thinned and browned, the trees letting fall their leaves and standing gray and open under a hard and cloudless sun, the cenotes sinking slowly toward their lowest level as the buried water was not replenished, the land drying and cracking, and the dust rising on the worn paths, and the heat building day upon day toward the end of the season. It was in the late dry season, before the rains, that the fields were made ready, the chosen plots of forest cut with stone axes, and the felled wood left to dry and then burned, so that the smoke of the clearing fires hung blue over the flat country in the still hot air, the ash spreading a thin fertility over the thin red soil in readiness for the planting. With the first heavy rains, which came up from the southeast and built each afternoon into tall gray towers of cloud that broke over the land in warm downpours, the maize was sown into the ash and the softened ground, the seed set with a digging stick into holes punched in the earth, the beans and the squash sown among it, and the long labor of the wet season began, the weeding and the tending and the guarding of the growing crop against the deer and the birds and the rot. The wet months were green and heavy and loud with the afternoon storms, the forest leafing thick and dark, the cenotes rising again as the rain found its slow way down through the stone, the milpa standing tall, and now and again in the lateness of the season, a great storm came in off the warm eastern sea and crossed the peninsula in a long day of driving wind and rain. Then toward the autumn the rains drew off, and the harvest came in, the maize gathered and dried and stored in the raised cribs and the sealed jars against the long dry months ahead. The surplus of the good years set by, for the bad years came also when the rains failed or fell short, and the stored grain stood between the people and hunger. On the rain the whole city depended utterly, for there was no river to draw upon, and no spring, only the buried water of the cenotes and what fell from the sky in its season. And so the rain god Chak, the hook-nosed, long-snouted divinity of the storm, was carved again and again across the upper facades of the buildings, his masked face set in long rows along the cornices of the older southern ranges and stacked one upon another at their corners, watching over the only water the country had. The maize did not stand alone in the fields, for the people set among it the climbing beans that ran up its stalks, and the squash that spread its broad leaves along the ground between, the three grown together so that each gave something to the others, and the plot yielded more than any one of them alone. And about the houses the gardens held the chili, and the root crops, and the fruit trees that did not wait upon the single harvest of the field. In the favored plots near the cenotes, where the water lay nearer the surface, a second planting might be raised, and the careful household kept its grain in the raised cribs and the sealed jars and the dry hollows against the long dry season, and against the year when the rains came late or fell short. For in a land that lived upon the sky, the failure of a season pressed at once upon the stores. The rhythm of the work followed the water through the year, the cutting and the burning of the fields in the dry heat before the rains, the planting with the first storms, the long tending through the wet months, the harvest as the rains drew off, and then the quiet of the deep dry season when the fields lay fallow, and the labor turned to the building and the trade and the keeping of the rights. The turning of the year was thus a turning between thirst and plenty. The long bright dryness when the land waited and the cenotes fell and the fields were burned, and the green loud wetness when the rain came and the maize grew and the wells filled again. And the city read this, turning closely, and ordered its labor and its rights by it, the planting and the harvest and the watching of the sky and the offerings to the rain, all set to the one great division of the year between the dry and the wet. Toward the close of the 12th century and into the 13th, the great building at Chichén Itzá came to its end, and the political weight of the northern peninsula moved away westward to the walled town of Mayapan, which gathered to itself in the centuries that followed the role the older city had held. No single event marks the change in the ground, no layer of burning laid across the whole center, no sign of a taking by force that leveled the place. The monumental building simply ceased. The platforms and colonnades and courts were no longer added to or renewed. The dressing of new stone and the burning of lime for new plaster came to a stop, and the dense population that the stone core had served drew down and dispersed across the countryside into the smaller towns and the scattered houses of the plain. The turning came in a time when much of the wider Maya world was changing, when the cities of the southern lowlands had long emptied, and the records read in the lake muds of the peninsula speak of seasons of failed rain that pressed upon a land already living close to the margin of its water, and the gathered city upon the dry shelf may have felt that pressing as keenly as any. Whatever the weight of the dry years, the city emptied by degrees rather than at a stroke, the great works left standing as they were, the plaster slowly weathering from the stone, the thatch of the abandoned dwellings falling in, and the forest beginning its long return across the cleared ground and the swept plazas. Yet the place did not fall wholly silent, for the sacred cenote kept its hold upon the people of the peninsula long after the temples about it had emptied, and the offerings continued to be carried to its rim and cast into its green water across the post-classic centuries, the gold and the jade and the copal still given to the well when the city that had raised the causeway to it was no longer a living city. Pilgrims came to the cenote from far across the peninsula generation after generation, into the time of the divided post-classic towns and the lords who ruled them, and even into the years after the coming of the Spanish, and the memory of the place and its well outlasted the living city by a long span. The dispersal of the people did not empty the northern country, for the smaller towns drew the population to themselves, and the land went on being farmed, and the cenotes went on being settled, the life of the peninsula continuing in a more divided form under the lords of Mayapan, and after that town in its turn emptied, under the many small lordships into which the country broke. The memory of the great city held in the speech and the records of the later Maya, who kept in their painted books and their recited histories the names of the places and the lords and the turnings of the cycles of time. And when the Spanish came to the peninsula, and a friar among them set down what he could learn of the country and its past, the people still told of the city and its well and the offerings given to it, and still made their way to the cenote to cast in their gifts. The stone core stood through all this as it had been left, the forest closing over the lower buildings, and the plaster falling from the walls, the great pyramid and the ball court, and the colonnades standing gray and overgrown above the trees, known to the people of the country, and visited by them, but no longer the center of a living city. The decline of Chichén Itzá was thus not a ruin in a day, but a slow turning. The building ended and the people gone out from the center. The political power moved elsewhere. The great masonry left to the weather and the forest, and the one thread of continuance running on at the cenote, where the water that had first fixed the city to its place went on receiving the offerings of those who came to its edge for centuries after the plazas had grown quiet. What stands now upon the flat shelf of limestone is the stone core of the city, cleared again of the forest that had covered it, and held against further fall by the long work of clearing and shoring and rebuilding that began in earnest a little more than a century ago and goes on still. The place was drawn and described for the wider world in the 1840s by the travelers who came to the overgrown ruins and set down their account in word and engraving, and in the years about the turn of the next century, it passed into the hands of one who dredged the sacred cenote of its gold and its jade and its bones, hauling the offerings of centuries up out of the green water, and afterward the great institution that worked the site for many seasons cleared and mapped and rebuilt the center, raising the fallen colonnades and consolidating the platforms and tracing the buried causeways. El Castillo rises restored above the cut grass of the main plaza, its 9 terraces and its 4 stairways made whole, the carved serpent heads at the foot of the northern stair intact, and the band of light and shadow still descending its balustrade on the afternoons about the equinox, though the pyramid is no longer climbed, and those who come stand below it on the level ground to watch the serpent form and fade. The great ball court holds its long parallel walls and its high stone rings and the carved panels along its base. The Warriors' Hall stands with its hundreds of columns ranked open beneath the sky, where the roof they once carried has long since gone. The round caracol keeps its tower upon its broad terraces, and the white causeways can be traced across the ground, the longest of them still running north to the broken rim of the sacred cenote with its green water far below. The dwellings of pole and thatch are gone without a trace, as are the painted plasters that once made the city bright and the perishable goods of its daily life. And what remains above the ground is the masonry and the carving, the stone stripped of its plaster and weathered gray, and below the ground and the water the things the cenote and the buried chambers have kept. The place has been studied across more than 100 years by the dredging and the diving of the great well that brought up its gold and its jade and its bones, by the excavation of the platforms that opened the buried temple within the great pyramid and the throne of the red jaguar, by the mapping of the causeways and the outlying groups, and in recent times by the survey of the ground beneath the great pyramid with instruments that read the rock from the surface and found a cavity in water lying below its core. The same instruments and the divers who have followed the flooded passages have traced beneath the dry plain a wide network of water-filled caves and cenotes joined one to another through the limestone, the hidden water of the country mapped at last in its courses below the ground that gives no sign of it above. The site was set among the places held in common trust for their worth to all, named to the roll of the world's heritage in the later 20th century, and counted in our own time among a chosen handful of the great works of the past, and it draws now a great number of people across the year, most of all on the afternoons about the equinox, when the crowd gathers in the northern plaza to watch the band of shadow come down the balustrade and the carved serpent form upon the stone. The work of keeping the site goes on, the consolidating of the masonry against the rain and the root, the careful study of what was dredged from the well and what is found in the platforms, the survey of the ground, and the mapping of the buried causeways and the outlying groups that the forest still holds, so that the understanding of the place is added to season by season, even as the stone is held against further loss. The forest still stands close around the cleared center, the dry woodland that browns and greens with the turning of the year, as it did when the city was full. And at the day's end, when those who came to see the stones have gone, and the light goes long and gold across the plaster and the cut grass, the Great Pyramid throws its lengthening shadow across the empty plaza toward the line of the trees. The site is still there. The city is not.